Sorry. I guess I'll get started, or I'll start us off here. And for me, the discussion about monuments and statues is relevant and important for a couple of reasons. Like I said earlier, I grew up all over the country and of course in Guam, but I spent a large portion of my life, I would say my formative years, um, in Tennessee, in northern Tennessee, um, in a very out of the way town, Jellicoe, Tennessee. Population roughly 2,500. The literacy rate was about 50%. It was as deep south as you, or it was what you would imagine the deep south to look like, even though I guess technically isn't the deep south, but uh, it is a place where a character like Nathan Bedford Forrest would be very popular if people knew who Nathan Bedford Forrest was. And so growing up in that area, I of course was fortunate to be exposed to a lot of the history of the South and a lot of the history of the U.S. Civil War. My father's an amateur historian who, on all of our, school holidays, or uh, sometimes he just would pull us out of school, which was awkward because my mom was the principal, and would just take us over the road, and we'd go to Shiloh, we go to Antietam, we go to Gettysburg, we go to Richmond. We'd see all of these different the sacred ground that exists in the American East, and so I developed a vivid appreciation for the U.S. Civil War, which is probably what fueled me when I returned to Tennessee for college. It's what fueled my study of history. So I got my history degree at a university in outside of Chattanooga, Tennessee. I was there at Chickamauga. I was there at Lookout Mountain. I was able to, whenever we would do our community service days, it was always to go in and improve the battlefields. We'd go in and we'd pull Chinese privet, or we'd dig trenches, or we'd clean up the park in some area. And so a lot of my formative years were spent in those places. And so I can tell you that with some like small bit of like romantic exaggeration, there's something that's really impressive when you're pulling through these rolling green fields, or these rocky orchards, or these forests, and you see a sculpture, you see a monument to a specific key leader in that place. And so I grew up with a vivid appreciation for those monuments. Of course, as I began to understand what those monuments meant to me, and then started to put those in what context I could with what those meant to other people, then my thoughts and feelings on those monuments changed. And then it was interesting because, as you know, I'm trying to grapple with my understanding of the difficult history of America in general, and the position taken by the American South during the Civil War, and somebody who did the things that Nathan Bedford Forrest did during his life, that as he became a focal point for this debate, both several years ago, like we were talking about earlier, Ethan, with I think when Black Lives Matter was just becoming kind of a national movement, and people started to recognize the significance of the monuments that were around them, that it was important to not let my romantic, I guess, feelings drive my total perspective, I guess. And so I started to look at some of these statues, and kind of why they were built, when they were built, where they were built. And my favorite one is the one that I think we've seen most in the news, which is the Jack Kershaw statue outside Nashville of Nathan Bedford Forrest, where Stephen Colbert said something that was hilarious about it, and I can't remember, but it was like a nutcracker riding a wet lizard, I think is what he said. But it was this just really poorly developed statue that was created by an avid racist in the South that was really excited about his idol to Nathan Bedford Forrest, and I think he probably deserves, or not probably, I think he deserves every bit of criticism that's coming out, both about the origins of the statue, the purpose of the statue, and just the hideousness of the statue.
The artistic value.
The artistic value, or lack thereof. So I realized that I said a minute ago, let's have some quick 2 minutes on what we think about monuments, and I'm on 6. But it is important, at least for me, to say that this has been a very important part of my childhood and my adult life. I went and studied military history at Norwich University and in Vermont, and a lot of my study was on the American South during the U.S. Civil War. And so I'm really passionate about this issue, and I'm excited to see where it can go in our conversation. And if I'm moving clockwise for me around the picture, Peter, you're the next item up for bid.
And that was Brett, by the way.
This is Brett. Yes, it's important that we start saying that for people who can't see us.
So I'm Peter. My history with statues and monuments, I think, also stems from an interesting place. Growing up in Guam, there were a lot of statues. I don't know, Brad, if you remember that. Chad, probably less so. There's Chief Kapua that we drove around every single day on the way to school.
Yep.
And this very proud indigenous warrior chief that was a really key part of Guam's history. There were a lot of World War II statues. I believe there was also a recreation of the Iwo Jima somewhere on the island. I can't remember where. And so those are things that I really grew up looking at in a really important way, like kind of really some awe around. I mean, I've actually never stood next to the Chief Kapua statue because it's in a circle. People drive around it all the time. But I remember looking at that with quite a measure of awe, like, wow, here's an impressive man. Like, they built a statue to him that I drive around every single day on the way to school. And so I think that has been really impactful in my life. And I, very similar story to you, Brett. I studied history. My grandfather was a big Civil War historian as well as Air Force history. I've got huge shelves of books right here of both Civil War and Air Force history. And so I ended up studying history in college as well. I can't say that I have a hard belief around monuments because I'm conflicted. And I'll state the two areas, and I think these will kind of be the two directions that we debate in this. I think there's a lot of pain. You look at statues in the South, there's a lot of pain and anguish around leaders that are being held and honored in the South. And there's a lot of very well-deserved angst at that. And yet there's also, I think, I was talking earlier before we were recording about people talking about tearing down the statue of Gandhi in London today. And I think there's a danger that we face in our current society of saying I disagreed with one person's belief in this one specific issue, and so nothing of their work in general was of value. And I think that's a really dangerous road to go down. You look at people like Martin Luther King Jr., who was an incredible man in our country's history that drove the civil rights movement forward, and yet was also very flawed in that he cheated on his wife constantly. That there's no man that's going to live up to perfect scrutiny. That's not going to happen. And so I don't know where that line is, and I think that's kind of what we're going to be discussing today. But I think that line is really important, and you talked about this a little bit, Brett, of when was the statue put up? Why was it put up? And then really, how do we look at our country's painful history? And I think Germany's done a really good job of that, post World War II. And I think some of our statues deserve more to be in museums and going, this guy's in here, he was a bad dude. But we need to know that history so we don't repeat it. It's probably worth having some really bad guys in our museum so that we don't repeat those things. So that was a really long and confusing way of saying that I don't know, and I think often things have to be taken on an individual basis.
Ethan, what say you?
Well, statues are symbols. They're a category of symbol. And I don't like many symbols. I don't like what they do to humans. They increase our potential for good and bad. And I wish we'd leave them out of it and stay closer to home, and do with fewer rallying cries and causes. And because I view all of those things as oversimplifying things, and that's something we kind of talked about here. And maybe when we get to movements and we talk about protests, we'll talk about that too. But protest and marching and slogans are kind of by definition inarticulate, and I've had some experience with that in my own person. I have complicated ideas, and to me, complicated ideas are what the lack of complicated ideas is the problem in the world. People try to simplify things, but they come from such different places that when they simplify, they guarantee their conflict, and their path out lies in complexity, in my mind, and allowing complexity, recognizing it, allowing it to interplay. And to me, symbols drag us in the other direction. About the only symbol I can think of that I don't have any negative thoughts about is the Statue of Liberty. I mean, you look at the American flag. I mean, what flag flew over the Trail of Tears? So what symbols are there that aren't problematic? And so my thoughts revolve around that. I'm going to be more abstract. I view monuments as a subset of symbol, and I have a really rocky relationship with symbols, and I think we could do with a lot fewer of them.
All right. That's great. I think that that's going to give us a whole other like line of thought that we can hopefully collaborate around. Chad, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm going to keep this fairly brief. So I don't have any particular attachment. I don't have any particular attachment to monuments. In my view, their purpose is to act in some way, as Ethan said, as a symbol, and to try to tell a brief history. And sometimes that history isn't entirely honest. So I think that the concern by some is that we're erasing history by taking down monuments, which I don't really entirely see to be true. But in fact, in some ways, we may be erasing history in a sense by keeping a monument in place without any contextualization. So anyways, that's my brief statement on monuments in general.
All right. Yeah, that's good. And I'd like to pretend like I'm pulling this out of my head, but I'm not. I Googled it. The word monument comes from the Greek or Latin, which means the Greek, and I'm going to mispronounce either of these. But the Greek and the Latin root means to remind, to advise, or to warn. And I think it's interesting because you have to remind, to advise, or to warn as the foundation for what we're going to talk about today, because there are people who will say that a monument to Nathan Bedford Forrest deserves to be there to warn us to not have any more Nathan Bedford Forrests. And that same monument is going to have people reminding them of what he did for the South, if that's their cause, or, to advise them what they should do when the South rises again. I don't really know. Ethan, I thought it was interesting because it almost sounded like you were saying that to you a monument is equivalent to a meme. Is that accurate?
That's interesting, and I've wanted to dig myself back a little deeper into the origination of meme, which I believe started with Dawkins, at least recently, talking about social evolution in a sense, and linguistic evolution. Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's like your classic Darmok and Jalad at Tenegra, right? From Star Trek Next Generation, where the classic episode where they find a race that communicates in memes, and what it often is stating a person's name and an event together, and it would be, and then that carries this entire cultural understanding of those emotions and that meaning, or this virtue or something, and that seems to be almost the very thing that a monument of a person is designed to do. Stanford Raffles, standing in the middle of the square in Singapore, says things about achievement in colonization and ambition and administration and so forth. And so, yeah, I think that is what I'm saying. I'm saying it's a meme.
I actually want to make sure I'm fully understanding, because I think there's two parts to what you're saying. And also this is kind of going back to your original statement, like statues and symbols very quickly become jingoistic. So we're not actually putting nuanced thought into something. It's just an easy slogan. You can't really boil down a true human thought into a slogan. And then second of all, or a human being. Yeah. But we allow it because it's easier than having to think through something in a difficult idea, for instance. And then the second thing I'm hearing, again, I want to make sure that I'm hearing it correctly, is like there's a story from the Buddha that he says, I'm a finger pointing at the moon, and most people are looking at my finger. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, and I think it's somehow like, when you organize a religion, you open that door to losing track of the God the religion is about, and it becomes about the people or the places or the books or something, but not about that core idea. And I feel like my huge worry about almost all symbols is that they will become that. And so I'm always on that side going, forget the finger, right? Forget the symbol, forget the rock, forget the word, whatever it is. Look at the thing.
Yeah.
So let me ask a question then. Are humans capable of that? Of living without symbols?
I think the simplest answer is probably not today, and no one person is at all times. I guess I sit where I sit and I look in the direction I look because I feel like in that direction lies our progress.
Okay.
I would actually argue, I think that's an individual question, Chad. I think symbols often become something for us to mob around, which is that's where we're not thinking, is that we mob around something like, look at, this statue should go down. No, it shouldn't. Nobody that's in the middle at the front of that conversation with the ropes around the statue or trying to fight the statue from being torn down is actually looking at the real thing. They got an emotional pull to whatever that is.
No, I agree. I don't want to diminish the harmfulness of symbols and that, but I just am a little bit reticent, first of all, to say that we can live without symbols, because I think as humans, we're not capable of that. Secondly, I think symbols can have, and Ethan acknowledged this in the intro, symbols can point towards something that can be very beneficial, or can pull people towards something that's very beneficial. So,
well, that's where I'm saying I think there's an intensely personal question rather than a universal question. Can people live without symbols? Can I look at the moon more than I look at the finger? That's a personal question, I think.
Yeah, and I tend to think that we are, as a society, better when we can get consensus and feel involved and feel the safety and the love associated with a community. And for me, symbols oftentimes will play into community building because it's maybe a simple way to remind everybody who's in that community, this is what we stand for and this is who we are. But I can
orient ourselves about.
Exactly, and I can agree that can be perverted. One of my favorite, I guess, anecdotes about the symbol, I don't know if I brought this up in one of our previous conversations or not, but 45th Infantry Division in Oklahoma City it had played a major role in World War I, World War II. They liberated Dachau. And up until World War II, their emblem, their insignia was the swastika. And so when Hitler co-opted the swastika and perverted the swastika, and now that is the swastika, they had to change to another symbol, and it was the Thunderbirds, another the Thunderbirds. But yeah, it's interesting how easy it is to pervert a symbol sometimes. And that could be true of the and actually, honestly, I don't know if this is a true perversion, but the Confederate battle flag, right? And there are a lot of people who see that as okay because it's history, right? You know, and I would say that I know people who genuinely believe that to not be a symbol of racism, even though it flew in the battles of the Civil War to keep slaves in the South, it flew across the fields and in the forests of the Ku Klux Klan, and today it flies in some of our most some of our most negative memories. But that's why I thought it would be interesting, and I now don't think it would be, because we spent quite a bit of time just introducing the concept of monuments, but to talk about the origins of the American Civil War and what we all think. But I think we could definitely end up going down a rabbit hole there that would cost us our evening and everybody else's attention.
So, so where do you want to head in the discussion?
Well, I've got a starting point for my ideas, and I kind of have a list, but to me this is the most important one.
Okay.
And I think it can for me it slices through a lot of the questions. Are we talking about state speech, and what do we think about state speech? And this simplifies it a lot for me because I'm against most state speech, period, even if it's about state butterflies. To me, states should be silent. The government should be silent. It should do exactly what we have tasked it to do and have no opinions and speak no opinions otherwise. So to me, the monument question is very different when it's in a private park that somebody donated the land for and donated the money for, and they put up a statue of somebody who was a Civil War hero on the wrong side or whatever, versus it's in the middle of the county courthouse.
Right.
Or it's flying on the flagpole at the state legislature. Yep. or something like that. And then it's as easy as me coming down against having a statue of the Ten Commandments in a courthouse in the South as well, right? These things create a appearance of impropriety, of partiality. They could well threaten, people with certain backgrounds who visit those places. And while it may well be a problem for a private party to do that, or for a private party to have done it in a prominent place in a town or a state, it's certainly a problem for the state itself to do it. And I think the same standard should be followed as we do, like for judges, about appearance of improprieties. If there's even the whiff of something, they're supposed to recuse themselves and say, I can't do this case. I was in school with the defendant's brother-in-law, and that's close enough. The other judge in the next building can take it. Well, we don't need any particular monuments and statues up. And if there's a whiff of impartiality or impropriety in it, if it's state speech, then the answer is the state shouldn't speak that thing. And if it's not speech, well, then we don't need it, do we? If it's completely non-propositional, it's not pulling any weight, then why should anybody complain if it goes away? So I think I think to me, that's a clear case.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to approach it, Ethan. It's astounding to me that it was 2015 that the Confederate battle flag was taken down from the South Carolina legislature. I mean, that's astounding that it was left up that long.
Yeah, in the mouth of the state, the point is not some objective view of what it meant or what it meant to most people in the state. It's what it means to even very tiny minorities in the state. if that is something bad, it should go away.
But and I think what we're talking about here is the complex nature of our elected officials and the bureaucracy that exists in these places. I think that the concept Shelby Foote calls the great compromise that had to take place, where the South had to realize that the Union was better unified, but also could be proud of the work that they did to try the second American Revolution, and trying to get that generation during the Reconstruction period to not flare back up into civil war, and so to allow states to be able to. I mean, I think Alabama had the battle flag for quite a while in their state flag. South Carolina, Georgia has had it. That as we progressed in our understanding of what that meant to a large portion of of those states' population and of our history as a nation in general, the bureaucracy didn't catch up. And so there was always the fear of your constituents voting you out of office because you did something that displeased them. And then the other side of that is, what is their purpose as a function? Are they there as a function to serve the voice of the people? And so I always kind of battle with that in my mind, understanding that we're not a true democracy, that we're a republic, but at the state level, if it's put to a vote and it's voted to remain, then we have to have a deeper understanding of the purpose of the instrument or of the monument itself. And I think that's difficult because that's happened in some of those states. I think that's how, if I remember correctly, Alabama removed the battle flag, but I can't say that for certain because I don't know for sure.
Well, I think what Ethan is describing would re-envision the state's purpose and cause legislators to consider what is their role with their constituents, and how would that shift based on, being a libertarian versus Republican versus Democrat or other kind of liberal ideology.
I think it's important, though, to make the distinction that the ideology should be, at least as I understand what Ethan's saying, the ideology should be irrelevant.
Yeah, but Chad's saying that some people see a speech role for the state and have no problem with it. And just a bit of why I don't is because our representational relationship with the state is highly imperfect. And we always have to swallow things we don't like that the state does. I don't see why on top of it, we should have to swallow a bunch of utterly unnecessary speech.
Yeah.
Right? Literally up to and including a state flower. Just shut up, state. Shut up. We don't need you to pick the California poppy. Shut up.
So you don't believe that states need to market to get people to come visit their states to see their poppy?
I had never considered the state flowers, but you're right.
These things have effects. These things have effects in the market, and people realize that, and they desire to capture them, and they corrupt the state when they do it. It's not funny, and I'm not saying that to you guys. I mean, because it is funny, right? It's funny. Like, I can laugh about horrifying things. Of course, it's funny.
Yeah.
But underneath that, it's not funny.
Yeah.
States that have to market are never states you want to visit. Like, when I see commercials for a state, it's like Missouri and Arkansas.
Oh, wait a second. Arizona markets as well, and Arizona has some cool stuff. And I'm sure Missouri and Arkansas do as well.
I know Arkansas does. I have friends that live there. But anyway, that was a joke. But one of the things I was thinking about that we should talk about is I think often people feel like the left often feels like if you have an emotional attachment to this statue, it's because you're racist. And I don't think that's true. The example I'll give is that on the steps of the courthouse in Walla Walla, there's a statue, or just off the steps of the courthouse in Walla Walla, there's a statue of Christopher Columbus. Is that still there, Ethan?
Yeah, I just signed a petition to have it taken down. Is that relevant to this conversation? Do I need to recuse myself?
You're going to ruin all the people
I'll
I'm
allow
about to
it
quote for my senior thesis. So I wrote my senior thesis for my history degree on Italians in Walla Walla and the racism that they experienced, which overall, compared to most racism, is very limited. But they feel a very, very strong attachment to Christopher Columbus. And it's not because Christopher Columbus misnamed the indigenous people of our country or landed on the wrong place or took slaves back to Spain, or probably, I think there's stories of him raping very young girls. There's no sense of that. That's not what they're tied to, but there's something around, Italians weren't even considered white in this country until I think the 1920s or 1930s, there's something where they feel like they've been through things, and here's a tie now. Here's something that says it's okay to be Italian in this country. Because they didn't feel that. I mean, I interviewed some people in their 90s, and they did not grow up thinking, they were ashamed of having their last name having a vowel at the end of it. And so I think there are a lot of arguments to be made for monuments and statues being removed that are really solid, but I also think we need to look at the other side of that. And Brett, you're talking about Nathan Bedford Forrest. I would guess that most of those people aren't like, yeah, he owned slaves, and I want, that's probably not where they're coming from. They're going, I live in the backwoods of Tennessee in a really poor area, and this guy is a guy that fought for me, right?
He stuck it to a lot of these northern troops that came down into our sacred sovereign land. And I'm speaking for them. I'm not speaking for myself here.
Yeah, same. But, yeah, and so I think we need to address that, because what is that? I think that it's easy for us to join the mob of the majority, and I tend to agree that I think a lot of Southern monuments should be removed. But I don't think that we're doing any justice to our argument by saying people that are against it are racist or anything like that.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, and I almost don't want to discuss the background of the Civil War, because I feel like that's become a real litmus test. Either you say, of course, the Civil War was entirely and only about slavery, or you get canceled. And I don't think any war that has ever been fought by humans on Earth has ever been about one thing. So I can't do that. I can't give people those words. So let me share, Peter, what I said when I signed the petition to take the Columbus statue in Walla Walla down. I said something along the lines of, we tend to put up monuments and statues of people, not to celebrate that individual per se. Largely, we're trying to recognize a virtue or a spirit of achievement or something, right? And so with Columbus, it's adventuring. It's a spirit of adventure and willingness to, strike out into the unknown, and to be a leader, to drive men to do that, and so on and so forth, and then to succeed. But I said, then sometimes later down the road, 20 years or 200 years or whatever, we realize we picked a pretty unfortunate example.
Yeah.
And a lot of these things that we like to honor about people or events are what I call secondary virtues. Like, you take a virtue like bravery. Well, plenty of Nazi soldiers were really brave, and their kids can feel good about that. But we don't need a statue of a Nazi soldier to commemorate bravery. We could just as easily pick somebody that was on the right side of a war and was brave. And there's a lot of secondary virtues tied up in our symbols and our statues that people go, no, I'm not racist, I just like this thing, and they name the secondary virtue. Well, then don't put up somebody who fell down big time on the primary virtues.
Yeah.
Right. And so Columbus, really not
cool. A good guy.
Not a good guy, right? And I don't know, Vespucci, maybe?
I was just going to say Vespucci.
I don't know. Nobody knows, right? That's why he could end up on a pedestal, and then in 100 years, people go, oh, no, Vespucci, terrible guy, Maybe let's do our research this time.
I think he'd be perfect because we don't know enough about him.
Yeah, if we want an Italian back up on the pedestal. I didn't even know Columbus was Italian. I thought he was Spanish.
Cristobal Colombo was his real name.
Okay.
So,
yeah.
So Ethan, that takes us a very interesting kind of detour, I guess. What do you named secondary virtues of bravery or bravery as a secondary virtue? What do you
Timeliness,
primary?
showing up on time. That's
Cleanliness.
if it's to the meeting about how to kill a bunch of innocent people, I'd rather you be late. If it's for our webcast, I like timeliness.
On time,
Timeliness
yeah.
is a good secondary virtue. Maybe a tertiary virtue.
I,
The primary
Can I use the
virtues
monumental
to
pun
do.
yet? No.
so, Chad, did you want to go further into that, or?
Well, yeah, no, I was curious what
Okay.
and to me, I think why this is important. Well, not necessarily in the context of what Ethan will say, because I'm sure it's very insightful, but in the context of this whole discussion on monuments, is we're deciding what the primary virtues are, and those shift over time, right? Like as a society, so we're no longer saying this primary virtue of bravery is valuable. And
That's true.
now,
I mean, back 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, bravery was a primary virtue.
right. And so we're changing what the virtues are within society, which is fine. Like that's expected. But we're judging the past based on our new primary virtues, which not that there's necessarily a problem with that, as long as we're okay with the idea of, hey, in the future, I'm going to be judged on a new set of primary virtues.
That's why we keep arguing about how the right side of history. I'm fascinated by how often that's thrown around these days.
I think that's one of the most important things that we need to talk about is, I saw something the other day that like there are people that want to tear down all references to Abraham Lincoln in our country because they're saying he's anti-black. And if you looked at him compared to now, yeah, he probably is. But if you look at him compared to his contemporaries, yes, there were abolitionists that were further than him, and that's awesome for them. But he was the first man to invite a black man to the White House. He was a politician that was way ahead of his time compared to most people. And I think that we need to be cognizant that that's a big deal. That's a big deal that somebody was ahead of the thought that was prevalent in their day. And I don't think that gets talked about very much.
And Frederick Douglass, who is the black man that came to the White House, felt like Lincoln treated him entirely as an equal.
Yes. And the same thing, and I think that allows society to grow in a way where we're not going, everyone, even 20 years ago, was terrible because they believed things in the 80s that I could never believe now, whatever. But I mean, it also allows us to grow through our lifetimes because you look at Gandhi, and my guess is the reason they were talking about tearing down the statue of Gandhi is that he was pivotal in writing the documents for apartheid in South Africa, which is a horrific thing. I don't think there's anyone that would debate that apartheid wasn't terrible. And yet Gandhi grew to regret that and led the movement in India in an incredible way. Now, are we going to judge Gandhi at 20? Or are we going to say Gandhi's body of work, actually, I really agree with a lot of it. Yeah, there were things that were problematic, but he actually came out and said, I'm sorry about those things. I regret those things. I don't want to be judged that way 30 years from now because I've done problematic things for my own self. I think we have to have ability to grow as a society and as people without being canceled.
Yeah. So, sorry, I went through puberty there a little bit.
Almost there.
And it's called presentism, which is the idea that we should or shouldn't judge the past by our current moral standards, right? It's Solomon was the wisest man who ever lived and built the temple, and he was really great, but he had all of these wives and he kept slaves and he, all these other things. So I do think that that is a great thing that we could debate just outside of this is how we look at history. But I guess coming to the idea of the practical solution, if you have one, for symbols or for monuments, because I'd like to know what you think is what realistically could be done. Ethan, I think I'm pretty clear in what you think should be done. And do you believe, Ethan, that there's a path to that currently?
Yeah, for basically removing a lot of these.
These symbols, the monuments, statues.
No, I think it's a pretty niche opinion, and I would state that in a way that's kind of derogatory of everyone, which is that it's a niche statement because everybody loves the idea of state speech if they can capture it. And so even somebody who's down and out in the state's never said anything for them, they don't necessarily want the state to stop speaking because, hey, maybe someday it will. They've got that vision. It's kind of like how the left talks about capitalism, and they're talking to the poor white person and going, "What, do you think you're going to be a millionaire one of these days? What do you think is out there for you?" I'm kind of to me, that's I don't respond to that too well, but to me, that's kind of what I'm saying about what I would say statists everywhere. They may not be in this term, but they dream of a day when they are, and they get to speak with the voice of the state and have all of that influence. And so they're not against state speech per se in this way. I do think we're kind of coming to an interesting place in our conversation, which is cutting across the grain of all these comments. What I think can be said truly of the discussion is that we're saying it's case by case basis. Particular statute, even Confederate war heroes are not a class of statue that needs to get pulled down. Who were these people? Are we honoring, maybe that model of primary or secondary virtues? What were their reasons for doing the things they did? What did people on both sides of a conflict think about them? What does this thing mean to people today? Let's talk and hear from the people that are saying tear it down. Why are they saying tear it down? What are they saying it means to them? And ditto for the people saying leave it up. If you put that possibility out for every statue, that's a good thing in and of itself. The answers don't all have to be, yeah, it's coming down. But we should follow a process with every single one.
Yeah, no, I think we're relying on civility to weigh in heavier than discord, which it seems to be the only way that if we see this as progress, the only way progress has been made is by people actually throwing a rope around a statue and pulling it down. And I think that that's symptomatic of our environment. We would rather physically pull down the symbol of what we disagree with than feel like either we don't have a voice to engage in the conversation about that symbol, or to take the time, energy, and just the hard work to engage in conversation about that symbol.
And I'm not opposed to tearing them down lawlessly, so to speak, because here's the thing: if a state overplays itself and it puts out speech that is controversial, well, you know what? Statues are vulnerable speech. They can get a rope thrown around their neck and hauled down, and it's a lot of work and money to put back up, and people can just do it again the next night or the next month. So there's a litmus test for you. If your statue stays up, I guess enough people agree with it. And if it comes down, and here's my point, and this is why it comes down to some of my libertarian principles. If it comes down, who is hurt? Like nobody. There are no harms involved here.
Yeah,
I was gonna say. I mean, it's come like for some of these.
It's democracy in action, I guess, is what
have been on state property. It has been, as we mentioned before, with the Confederate flag in South Carolina. It has been surprisingly late how long it has taken for those things to come down. And so it took people literally tearing them down, climbing the flagpole and tearing them down. And so at some point, I agree with Ethan, like if it stays up, that's the voice of democracy. And if it comes down, in a sense, I mean, I agree that there's probably a line where that, that would cross into problematic for me, but because I definitely don't think we should tear down all the monuments to the Civil War or even necessarily Confederates in the Civil War, but I definitely don't believe in pulling down Lincoln's monuments. But yeah, that is an interesting idea.
I have a question for you, Brett, because this is something, having spent very little time in the South, I can't really comprehend, is that people that are like flying the Confederate flag and really proud of that also seem to be the people that are like, America, F yeah, kind of thing. And I'm like, I think it's pretty hard to argue that the Confederacy wasn't treason.
Yeah.
So that seems like some cognitive dissonance there.
Well, and
that to me?
I will try to explain all Confederate flag flying Southerners, carpetbagging Northerners. No, no, you've stayed out of our South, and I appreciate it. No, I,
I came to see you once in Southern.
that's right. I think it comes
It was too humid for me. You can have it.
I think the point we go back to is the symbol. So I'm going to say, and I'm going to just go out on a limb and make a guess, the vast majority of the people who fly a Confederate flag do so to provoke more than to honor. I know plenty of people, even people who went to Southern. There was a gentleman who I was in college with who would pull a flag, built a flagpole in the back of his pickup truck and would pull up a Confederate flag, a huge Confederate flag, and drive it around campus because he knew that it got people upset. And his personality, and it wasn't even because he hated, he wanted to troll people. He also orchestrated his own kidnapping at a Taco Bell with several Black members of our community, and it was hilarious but very criminal, and they were arrested for it because they had orchestrated this idea that there was some sort of retaliation coming in, and everybody was in on it. But for me, I would say that the vast majority of the people who fly that flag do so to instigate some sort of emotion. But I think with that comes the idea that that the Confederacy was fighting for values that that the federal government was violating their rights as a state, and one of those rights was the right to own people. But for the person who says America and the person who flies the Confederate flag, those are kind of synonymous. It's I believe in an America that I need to defend, mostly on the internet, mostly in my underwear, that we've lost sight of, which is what the South was feeling during, leading up to the American Civil War. They said, okay, we freed ourselves from oppression, from a king thousands of miles away, and now the exact same thing is happening from a president hundreds of miles away, and so we need to do exactly what we did before. And so that's where I would say that there's less, that those are more synchronous ideas than we like to say.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Because the easy view of it is like the South committed treason against the thing that you're saying, America, yeah. And so how are those?
I would say that there's similar thoughts and feelings to what Ethan is supporting in the physical destruction of government property, because they feel it has overreached into their personal lives or into their lives or into their space. That was the feeling, and that is still the feeling in a lot of ways. But then they'll come back and they'll support the states speaking for them.
Okay.
So I want to transition pretty quickly to kind of what Peter's and Brett's viewpoints are on what we should do with the monuments. I think Ethan has pretty clearly articulated what we should do with at least the state monuments or monuments on state property. But before we do that, I thought it would be helpful if we briefly mentioned, when many of these monuments were built, because that gives some context of what they were trying to accomplish with them, at least in the United States. And so you see a massive peak with monuments built on especially state property in the late 1890s, very late 1890s, and it really peaks around 1910. And then it drops off.
Jim Crow laws? Were they there to enforce that or create fear around that?
That was probably part of it. There's a number of reasons that I think that they put these monuments up. Part of it was to be menacing, probably, in some of these locations. Part of it was to venerate people, after the fact, after some of the history had been forgotten. Part of it was an attempt to rewrite history. There's probably all kinds of reasons why different monuments were put up. And that's something I think I'll talk about in my response to this, but I'm curious on Brett and Peter's response to monuments, especially those on state grounds.
So yeah, I think you had a lot of them that were funded by the Daughters of the Confederacy, right? And you had a lot of money now, a generation deep of people fondly remembering their ancestors, and and so there's probably a split, and I don't know if that's a 50-50 split or an 80-20 split, where it's let's create these icons that should instill fear into the population, and also let's create these icons that venerate our ancestors, our very recent ancestors in the strong work that they did. um, as far as what we should be doing moving forward, I disagree, Ethan, with what you're saying, only because uh, we have lost the ability to address kind of the underlying disease in our conversations. And so I believe that, and this may be optimistic, but I believe that we need to get to a point where we're willing to have difficult conversations about the actual problem, and not just attack the symptom of that problem. I think when we do that, we end up creating conversations that alienate people, or cause people to become, maybe not alienate them, but cause them to become defensive, which is also not a good thing. So if I see our country moving in the right direction, it's the states having difficult conversations with their constituency, not just about what this means to them, what a statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest means to them, but also what it could mean to their state. So when the transgender bathroom laws were being passed in some states in the South, you saw a massive backlash from companies and from states themselves. California refused any state employee the ability to travel to and stay in North Carolina. That's a huge thing. And so if you have a state that relies on tourism, on the business community being involved in your state, then I think the strongest weapon we have is the ability to sanction those who behave in a way that we collectively or individually don't agree with. And that we will move more slowly, but I think we will move more permanently in that way. And so I would love to see the statues, that communities refuse to support come down. If I was a member of the Black community living in a city that had a Nathan Bedford Forrest statue built by a racist in the early 2000s, I of course would want that to come down. And I can't um, I can't fathom what that would actually look like, trying to explain that to your children. But I also know that Robert E. Lee, and we talk about those, Ethan, correct me if I'm wrong, but the primary and the secondary ideas, concepts, and values. Robert E. Lee is one of those people. If we're going to have a statue, and if we're going to have statues of anybody, I really want to have a deep conversation about why his should exist. Maybe not on state property, because I also agree there's really no reason for us to have anything that does not speak for the people on state property. But also having walked through concentration camps in Europe and understanding the value of a visual depiction of what's happening, that there is a place for museums about the American South that show the tragedy of slavery and the crime of American slavery, but then also show that that's not all that the American South is or was. And I don't know if we're capable of having that. We can't get a Bible museum built. I mean, we did. It did. We didn't. But that seems like a very complex system to try and introduce in such a controversial area. And so it's just easier to pull that thing down or spray paint it or deface it or chop its head off and then feel like we've won something.
Yeah. I think I'm still conflicted in some ways, but I think there is a place on state property, Ethan. I think I disagree with that, but I think that place is a museum. And I think it is powerful for a state to address, as you were just talking about in Germany. They address very openly the concentration camps and the horrors, done by the Nazi Party in Germany. And I think it's very common for the German people to discuss those things in a very real and vulnerable way. And I think that would be a really incredible conversation for us to have here in the States, is conversations around slavery in the South. And yes, that it does include the South not solely being slavery. That's not all the South is about. Native Americans, you referenced the Trail of Tears earlier. I think that would be we've got a pretty rough history with indigenous people in this country. And I think we need to talk about that. The way the Japanese were treated during World War II. I mean, every time I drove down to see Chad in college, I drove past one of the internment camps where they kept the Japanese. There's still guard towers up out in the middle of the desert in California. And so that's where I see their place. And I think there needs to be a nuanced discussion around that. Robert E. Lee is different from Nathan Bedford Forrest or Jefferson Davis, or, and just because somebody was on the Union side didn't make him a good guy either. There have been a lot of horrors inflicted by everybody in this country. And so I think if we could have an open, honest discussion about that wasn't saying America is the worst place on earth, and also wasn't created the if you don't like it, leave it kind of thing. I think that would be a really positive place for our statues and monuments.
Let me agree with something you just said, Peter. I do poke a hole in my prohibition against state speech for fixing problems with previous state speech. So when a state is screwed up and it goes, oh, we screwed up, then it should say that, and it should correct it as best it can. Because that's its speech, and its speech has a long tail because it does come with authority and often money and other things. So there's usually work to be done there when it misspeaks.
So that is a perfect transition, I think, to my position on this, which is I generally think we shouldn't pull down statues. I do think we should have gotten rid of the Confederate flag flying, in front of Capitol buildings and that kind of thing long ago.
Well, hey, Mississippi outlawed slavery in 2013 or something, so we're making progress.
But what I do think should be done is place those monuments, and this is challenging, but place those monuments within context. And so create complexity for that discussion. And how this would actually work on an individual basis with an individual statue is probably difficult because, how do you, if Robert E. Lee is way up off the ground, how do you provide some degree of context so he doesn't appear venerated no matter what? But, one of the things that I think would be valuable is to have art that displays the horrific nature of slavery, especially chattel slavery in the United States, that is positioned directly next to these, statues, and could be commissioned to create understanding and employ, in a sense, artists that get to tell a different story. And obviously you'd want the community to have some sense of say in what story is told, but then you would then give the artist the leeway of, this is the story we want in general told, please tell it for us. So whether that's through sculpture or whether that's through painting or whatever it might be, that you get more of the complexity about that individual person and the role that they inhabited. And in addition, about maybe the statue itself. So if the statue was constructed in 1910, from the Daughters of the Confederacy with a major gift from so-and-so, that should be told about the statue there. Because what was the intention, if it is known, for why that statue was put up. And that would provide a significant context for everybody that visits that location.
So for instance, we'd put up a statue and it would say, "This is Taylor Swift, commissioned by Brett Mahoney in 2020." Something like that.
Yes.
Sure.
The purpose of just stirring the pot.
Yeah.
What will they argue about this statue in 100 years?
Brad, you just said earlier you commissioned a statue of Taylor Swift.
I said I'd have a conversation about Taylor Swift.
So, Chad, I like where you took that, because there's a corollary back. I mentioned 10 Commandments in a courthouse somewhere, and when one of those cases happened, one of the outcomes, or one of the potential outcomes, was, well, it can be there as just a thing, but since it is a public space, you have to allow other stuff. And
Right.
so, like, the Church of Satan was like, well, we want this horned,
That's Oklahoma City.
Yeah, we want this horned, devil thing to be put in the courthouse too. And I think the resolution was, oh, never mind, we'll make the 10 Commandments go away. And that's the perfect example of the problems of state speech, when all of a sudden you go, oh, but it's going to be fair. If everybody gets to do this, buckle up. And all of a sudden, oh yeah, no, state speech, very, very bad. We don't need any of that state speech, right? If you said, okay, we're going to let the BLM movement commission a piece of artwork to go next to the Bedford statue, I think they go, okay, yeah, never mind, we're going to pull him down.
It's going to solve itself. Well, and Chad, with what you were talking about, have you guys been to the Nixon Library? This is a very, very dumbed down example of what I think you're talking about. But have you guys been to the Nixon Library here in Southern California?
No,
Yeah.
So I went there. I went there almost as an adult. I think it was my senior year in college the first time I went there, and I was adult a mere 7 years later. But I was very curious as to how they would address Watergate. And you walk through the Nixon Library, and it's built by his foundation, and it's funded by his foundation, and you get to walk through his childhood home. You get to walk through all of his policies, Vietnam, or Southeast Asia in general, all the stuff that he was doing. And then you hit the Watergate room, and it's his tapes. It's playing the tapes, and you get to hear him commit a crime on tape. They don't hide from it. And I that
cool.
whole museum had so much more value to me, because it was inclusive of all of his presidency, including the most controversial and I guess unfortunate for him parts.
That's cool, right? Yeah, that makes me want to.
It can be very valuable just to realize somebody. I mean, like literally a treatment of Hitler in the museum. Like, have little kid pictures of him.
Mm-hmm.
Have him playing with a construction thing in the dirt. Because that disallows us one of the things we like to do with especially the worst humans, which is they're different than us.
Right.
And I'm not like that. And my kid isn't going to be like that, and blah, blah, blah. And then you see him playing in the dirt with a backhoe, and you go, oh,
yeah.
Actually, I don't know any of that.
This is how another one could come, is because
he
was a child just like everybody else has been.
Yeah. And it just makes you think, what went wrong? And what were the lines that he crossed in his head? And how do people not cross those lines?
Well,
and when you have a very darkened picture of him from only, whatever he was, age 30 or something on, you don't ask those questions.
Right.
You just go, oh, evil. We'll stick the evil label on it, as if that explains everything.
Yeah, it's not a person anymore. We've completely dehumanized. Hitler is a theory now, not a guy named Adolf that lived in Germany.
Well, he's a meme, to take this back to the beginning of the conversation.
Right. And also that frees you from having to do the hard work of figuring out how do we construct a state, going back to your thought, Ethan, of the state and the purpose of the state. How do we construct a state that would resist a Hitler?
That was one of the most interesting parts about our conversation last week that I really appreciated about Steve, the psychologist, that he's like, I don't care if they're racist police officers. I want a system that fights that innately. Like, there's going to be racist police officers or whatever. I thought it was a really nuanced view to say, like, what we need is a system that doesn't allow them to act in these certain ways, but I'm not trying to get in their heads to tell them what to think.
Yeah, that's huge.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we are rounding 9 p.m. here, and I just want to make sure that everybody had a chance to fully express their thoughts and feelings on statues and monuments.
I owe you an apology. I misquoted you because I thought you said you would commission a statue.
Oh, yes, no, it's important that we cleared that up.
I'd like to officially apologize.
Yeah.
I have an anecdote to share, and I'll let anybody else that wants to talk first. I don't know if we'll want this in the thing, but I think it'll amuse the three of you. So when we're ready to cut off, I'll share mine.
Well, why don't we do this then? Can we just start with Chad and just we'll come around and we'll just say some final things.
I mean, I'm good.
Okay.
I said my piece.
I'm very conflicted by the whole thing, and I think probably a lot more people than are willing to admit that they are conflicted by everything on both sides, and I think that would be a really good place to start the conversation.
And that's my feeling, is that this deserves a conversation. And I dream of a day we're in a society that's capable of having that conversation.
Yeah.
Our politicians who are able to have that conversation, and our celebrities who have the loudest voice right now, are too afraid to have any kind of a conversation as it relates to these controversial issues. And so I at least appreciate the three of you having that conversation with me. And Ethan, if you want to finish this up, and we'll move on.
Okay. Well, the sentences I would say about the particular wrap up is, I'd love to see a checklist. You know, a weighted series of tests like a court would use to judge, to judge a legal principle and how it applies to a case. I'd like to see us make one of those and then apply it to individual statutes. And it's about, why was it put there, and who put it there, and how well does it represent the people of the region that it's in today? And what do people know about it? Are they completely ignorant of what's written on the plaque? Do they have the wrong idea of what it was intended for? And you'll get the idea, I think, coming out of that test, of whether, does this fit? Does this belong?
I like that. Like, I think that would lend itself to even what I was describing as well, of creating some art to contrast with whatever it is that that was originally put in place.
I'd like to see that checklist in place for any future statutes.
Yes. Yeah. Forward looking. There we go.